Immunotherapy Patient Summit here in New York City in the afternoon session. For those of you watching via live stream and Facebook Live, welcome. And we hope that you'll enjoy what we have to share with you this afternoon. So earlier today, as part of the Q&A during the expert panel, Dr. Postow and Dr. Gandhi and von der Heide and Zamarin touched on clinical trials and some of the things that you need to know about clinical trials. And we wanted to have an afternoon session devoted specifically to that topic because it is a lot to consider, especially if you're unfamiliar with the clinical trial process. And hopefully, while there may be some things that were covered this morning, it never hurts to hear something twice, and hopefully this will be memorable for you. So what is a clinical trial, right? So this is research studies that involve people. We often hear of research studies that involve animals or that involve models, computational models. Well, these are research studies where we're actually testing something in patients. These trials are designed to answer specific questions about new and existing treatments. We heard earlier today some clinical trials may be testing combinations of an approved therapy with an experimental therapy or two approved therapies that have never been tested in combination together. And the goal of clinical research is to improve the outcomes of patients as well as their quality of life. So this kind of scary slide just is here to give you a little bit of context about where the clinical trials take place within the broader research spectrum from discovery to FDA drug approval. And you can see at the very beginning here that the drug discovery process, you can identify upwards of 10,000 potential drugs or targets for drugs. And then as they move through, maybe only 5 of those actually get to the clinical trial phase. And of those, maybe 1 will get FDA approval. The entire span of clinical research can take anywhere from 6 to 7 years, but you can see that there's a much longer arc there. Discoveries that start in the laboratory can take many years to get to an FDA drug approval. To the next slide. So we heard about the clinical trial phases, and while immunotherapy is kind of turning the paradigm on its head, still basically there are 3 phases that you as patients and caregivers are primarily going to be interested in. So phase 1 asks a very simple question: is the treatment safe? The purpose of this is it's often the first time a drug is given to a human. The goal of these early studies is to identify the safest dose or the maximum dose that you can give before you start developing toxicities. There is some monitoring of side effects that happens, and then we start to build a safety profile for the drug. And these are very small trials. They can have anywhere from 20 to 100 people. Phase 2 asks, does the drug work? So in this phase, we begin to look for what's called efficacy in treatment. So is the drug having an effect? Is the drug having the desired effect? Is the drug working or not? And then as well, you continue to monitor for safety issues. And these can be larger trials of upwards of 100 to 500 patients. Then phase 3, which is also often called a pivotal study, is what compares the investigational treatment after you've made it through phase 1 and 2, and you've identified it's safe, you've seemed to have some signals that it's effective. You now want to see, does it work better than what is currently available to cancer patients? So you'll compare this new treatment or this new combination of treatments with the current standard of care. And you get, because this is a much larger trial, anywhere between 1,000 to 5,000 people, you get a lot of data about the effectiveness and the safety profile of these drugs. And this is enough data, if it's collected in the right way and presented correctly, for regulatory agencies like the FDA to decide, okay, this is better than what's currently available. Let's go ahead and approve this and get this out to patients. Now, there are pros and cons to participating in clinical trials, and for anyone who's considering enrollment in a trial, this is a long, thoughtful process. You really want to be sure that you understand the risks and the benefits of participating in the trial. My experience has been that there tend to be more benefits than risks, and that's due to the very careful design of these studies and the safety protocols that are built into them to ensure that the risk to you is as minimal as possible. So possible advantages, you're getting access to the best possible care. You have a expert team of healthcare professionals who are very interested in you and in your response to this drug. So there's a lot of interaction, lots of visits. We heard Janie talk about all the scans she was getting and follow-up visits. But the good news is, they're very interested in you, and so they're going to make sure that you get the best care possible. In clinical trials, you can often get access to highly experimental or investigational drugs before anyone else does. And a lot of these, as we've seen in immunotherapy, patients that are being treated with some of these checkpoint blockades in phase 1 or phase 2 studies have, some of them, a percentage of them, have done very well. And they otherwise would not have had access to those drugs if it weren't for the clinical trial. Again, you're closely monitored by your medical team. You, as a patient, get to play an active role in your own health care. This is a voluntary process. After you examine all the information, you then decide, I'm going to do this or not. And it's recommended that you discuss this in consultation with your oncologist before you make a decision like that. But it is a way for you to stay completely engaged in your own health care. And then you're also contributing to the research in general. These are scientific studies. Data does come out of them. Lessons are learned that help other researchers develop more effective treatments. So you're contributing to that by participating in a trial. Just trying to advance here. There we go. You're helping future generations. Now, of course, there are some disadvantages. When a drug is being tested, there is an unknown risk profile. You don't know what effects the drug is going to have or whether or not you're going to have a negative reaction to it. Sometimes drugs don't work as they're intended. Not all patients may benefit. We heard there's a broad range in terms of some of these immunotherapy trials of the response rate of patients. It can be as low as 10%, upwards to 80% with the right combinations, even higher than that with some of the CAR T-cell therapies that we've heard of in certain forms of blood cancer, where you have response rates in the 90% range. Frequent tests and clinic visits might be a hardship. Often people are unable to travel to sites, or that's just a consideration that if you know that you're going to have to go every other week, as Janie had to do, you have to ask yourself, is that something that you can do? And then travel sites can be, we heard also that clinical trials can take place all over the country. It's not just in the academic research centers in the major cities, although that is where you tend to see some of the earlier phase studies and the more investigational treatments, the real cutting edge stuff. But in terms of the later stage studies, so the phase 3s, you can get access to phase 3 studies in many community oncology offices or clinics in your neighborhood. And as part of the search process, when you're looking for a clinical trial, you can set as one of your criteria a preference for location. You don't want to travel more than 50 miles to go, for instance. Others have the means to travel great distances. I spoke with someone here today who's from India, and she's interested in coming to the United States to participate in trials here that may not be available there. So there's a broad range, and you have to ultimately make your decision based on what's appropriate for you. Before you decide to volunteer for a clinical trial, there are a number of questions. This is just a sampling of questions. There are many more, and a great resource is that I pulled these questions from is a guide for patients and their families from a magazine called Patient Resource, which is available in a lot of clinics and cancer treatment offices. So first question you want to ask, why are we doing this trial? What's the rationale for this? You may be interested in what's the scientific question that underpins this, but more likely you're interested in why do you think this may help me? What sort of evidence is there that this could potentially work for me? What are the questions that you're trying to ask? Why do you think this treatment is going to be better than other treatments? What are my other options? Should I consider treatment with this first before standard treatment? Should I do standard and then a clinical trial? How have patients in previous studies fared? Was there a response rate? Was there a signal of effectiveness? How will my doctor know if the treatment is working? We hear of all different types of responses in the case of immunotherapy, where some patients on immunotherapy feel great. They get their infusion and they're off to the races. They go and they live their life and they have a very high quality of life. But that isn't the case all the time. Earlier today, we touched on the idea of side effects and whether or not there's an association between side effects and effectiveness of treatment. So at least in the frame of a clinical trial, if you're in a study where you may or may not be receiving the investigational treatment and you start having side effects, chances are you're probably getting the investigational treatment. How long will the trial last? Is this just, I'm sorry, we'll have an opportunity for questions in a moment. These slides, yes, thank you, that's a great point. All of these slides will be sent to you after the conference, so you don't need to take notes. I'm sorry I didn't mention that before. Thank you, he gets a prize. Okay, everyone, do some, relax your hands here. Do some stretches. All right, so just a few more questions. Can I continue to receive this treatment after the trial ends? What sort of procedures or tests are involved? So now I can go through these very quickly. I don't have to worry about you writing them down. What impact will the trial have on my daily life in terms of scheduling, travel, costs, as well as quality of life and any potential responses you may have to treatment? Do you have to travel? Will you be compensated for travel? Some programs are available that can help patients travel to and from clinical trial sites. How often will I need to travel? Will I be hospitalized, or is this kind of an outpatient clinic basis? And what costs, if any, will be my responsibility to pay? Like I said, these are just some of the questions. There are so many more. And what's really important is these are just a stepping stone for you to begin having a dialogue with your healthcare team. And every trial is different, and every trial may or may not be right for you. But asking these questions is one of the ways that you can get to that point where you feel confident that this is something that you want to do. But now, as Janie shared earlier on, getting into a trial isn't always a given. In her case, she didn't have a mutation that was specified. You had to have this BRAF mutation in order to enroll in the trial she was looking to enroll in earlier on. She didn't have that. So the reason for this is these, as I said, are carefully designed studies, and there are real scientific questions being asked. And as part of the scientific process, you've got to control the variables. You've got to decide, okay, this is the signal we're looking for. This is the noise we're going to make sure that we don't include. And therefore, we come to this trial design, which is a really long but thoughtful process. And it's also very exciting now to hear more and more of a patient-centric trial design. Patients are beginning to take more, or are encouraged to take more of an active role in how companies and academic institutions actually design these trials. So that's great. But there are a lot of criteria that are put in place, and any one of those criteria can cause you to not be eligible for the trial. So eligibility criteria is an extremely important thing to consider, and again, it's something to discuss with your healthcare professional. But the great thing about having these criteria is it also protects you from risk, because if you do have a certain mutation that we know will make you more susceptible to toxic side effects, wouldn't you rather your doctor knew that and said, you know, maybe this isn't the right trial, let's look at other options, maybe there's something else that's going to be safer for you. Cancer, some common criteria, it's your cancer type or stage, it's your treatment history, we spoke about that earlier today, what happens if you get a chemotherapy before an immunotherapy or vice versa. Again, it's different for every trial. Genetic factors, do you have mutations, your age, your medical history, and your current health status. Not everyone is up to being able to take on the potential risk of certain side effects. And so if you're not at a certain healthy stage, that's something to consider as well. So now let's just do some fun slides on myth versus fact. Okay, so I might only get placebo instead of treatment. Dr. Postow said earlier today that placebos, there is a role for placebo in clinical trials, but generally this is very, very rare. And in any instance, just ethically, if there is a treatment that's available for you, a standard treatment, you'll at least get standard treatment. There's almost no case where you go into a trial and it's a crapshoot. Maybe you'll get a treatment or maybe you won't. They're just rarely used. Trials are only for people who run out of treatment options. Last resort, we touched on this earlier today too. This perhaps maybe was the case earlier on, but in the last decade, we've seen immunotherapies in specific have shown tremendous promise in patients at earlier stages. And a lot of research is being done now to see where is the optimal time point in a person's treatment journey to give them an immunotherapy or a combination treatment. And we heard lots of exciting stuff this morning on the scientific panel about all the different combinations and questions that are out there. And the end result of that is we are learning how to treat patients better, and that's a good thing. I need to travel to a large hospital. I already said not necessarily. Doctors' offices in both urban and rural areas are often participating in clinical trials. Health insurance doesn't cover the cost of care in a clinical trial. Depends on your particular case, of course, and the insurance that you have covered, but visits, hospital stays, and certain testing procedures may be covered by your insurance. In the case of a clinical trial, any of the costs associated with that treatment, that is usually covered completely, and you're not responsible for that. But it's very important that you have a conversation with your health insurance provider about any specifics and that you discuss with the clinical trial team any additional tests or things. You don't want any surprise or gotcha costs sneaking up on you. Signing a consent form locks you in. Once you're in a trial, you're stuck. That's not true either. Again, this is a purely consent-based process. You, as the patient, are your own decision maker ultimately about whether or not you want to continue participating in a trial. For any number of reasons, if you decide you don't want to do it, that is your right. You'll be made to feel like a guinea pig. This is kind of a theme that we've heard often as we, as an organization, began to enter into the clinical space. We became aware that there was this worry that you're a lab rat, basically, in one of these studies, when in fact the opposite is true. You're almost an exalted member of the research team. Often I've heard that clinical teams will interact with their patients as if they were a member or a colleague or a peer because you're participating in this process with them and they couldn't do it without you. So that makes you very important. Clinical trials aren't safe. Of course, there's always risk when you're testing something that hasn't been seen in humans before or is given in a way that hasn't been given before. But as I mentioned, there are a lot of safety protocols that are built into this. So there's an institutional review board. So where the trial is happening, that institution has to sign off on this. There's a data and safety monitoring board. And then there's this informed consent process so that you always know what your rights are. Science is risky, and we don't know what we don't know, and that's the whole reason we have to do these trials, but it's only by doing that we get to the treatments that are then approved and help patients. And it's very heartening, at least to me in my observation, to see the amount of care that goes into building these so that you are as safe as possible. Again, it's just, these are sorts of things that go into your sense of having an informed consent. You have to have all the facts before and during a trial. And, be bold. It's your treatment plan. And sometimes we have to advocate for ourselves. And feel free to do that. This is your life, or this is the life of a loved one of yours. And, by all means, feel empowered to ask the questions and challenge your oncologist if you feel like you're not getting, you don't have a good dialogue, or he or she doesn't seem to be open to the ideas that you're presenting. So how do you find a clinical trial, right? In many cases, you can simply ask your doctor. A lot of doctors are aware of what's happening in the clinical space. Not all of them, of course. We have heard that, especially right now, as immunotherapy is just now kind of coming into its own and had to overcome a lot of hurdles in the earlier days, that many seasoned healthcare professionals who aren't really plugged into the cutting edge research may have a negative perception or don't believe that immunotherapy can work, even though there's tons of data now that says to the contrary. So if you run into a situation like that, what do? You go to another doctor. You get the blessed second opinion or the third opinion, if necessary. That's not to say just keep asking until you get the answer you want. It's to say keep asking until you get answers that can help you make an informed decision. There are also a lot of patient advocacy organizations who, as a service, connect